Welcome back. Now, Environment Minister Barbara Creecy has recently published a draft of South Africa's first sectoral emissions targets. These targets are an important element of South Africa's overall climate mitigation strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But there is no clear decommissioning schedule on the table, and all parties have agreed to. An acting program head for climate at the Centre for Environmental Rights, NPC, Brandon Abdinor, joins us now to look into what it takes for the climate mitigation plans to succeed. Brandon, a pleasure and a good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Nola, and good afternoon to the viewers. Thanks for having me on.
Wonderful, Brandon. I think maybe we can start off by, maybe rehashing where we are as a country in terms of our own nationally determined contributions and, then our day-to-day operations as a country, and then looking at this specific bill that we're trying to pass here.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nola. Yeah, our nationally determined contributions, those are our targets for greenhouse gas emissions reductions in terms of the Paris Agreement. They are rated by global ratings agencies as still being non-effective or inadequate. But we're sitting more or less in the middle of most of the countries around the globe on that front. Our 2021 updated nationally determined contributions were quite a somewhat satisfying improvement over the previous ones. And it's important to bear in mind that these get updated every 5 years. And there is an expectation in terms of the Paris Agreement architecture that there is ever increasing ambition. So we need to look at not only what our emissions profile is today, but also forecast into the future that the targets are going to get ever stricter.
And of course, now we are looking at legislation here at home that is, I think, supposed to, first of all, kind of be cohesive or coherent with all other legislation that we've had when we look at these sectorial targets. Brandon, this bill that we have out for public comment right now, does it do that?
It attempts to do that, and it does that in many ways. So just to clarify, that bill is in fact now sitting on President Ramaphosa's desk for signature. So all of the public consultation has happened already. And what it's going to do is put in place the framework architecture for the country's climate response. So it deals with institutional arrangements, which organs of state need to do what, and where the responsibilities lie at the different tiers of government. It also addresses climate adaptation. So really, how do we address those risks and impacts that are coming, no matter how well we do? And then finally, and very importantly, is the mitigation side of things. So how do we manage the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions? And the one key tool is the carbon budgets. So those are budgets that will get allocated to individual emitters. And just to clarify, those will be large companies effectively and SOEs like Eskom. And then the other one is the one you mentioned, which is the sectoral emissions targets, and that looks at different sectors such as energy, transport, human settlements, whatever it may be, and provides limits within which those sectors need to operate.
I want to speak specifically to, the carbon budgets that you've mentioned here. And of course, looking at then, Eskom and Sasol, both of them, I think, in the firing line recently with regards to emissions here. And when I think of the legislation that is out there, have we adequately, addressed those emitters? Because they are huge emitters within South Africa. They're the main emitters.
They are certainly the main emitters, and the carbon budget regulations are still being formulated. So the actual budgets are going to still to be allocated in hopefully the next 6 months or so. And obviously, when allocating those budgets, one will look at what the current emissions are, what the historical emissions are, and then what can be achieved going forward. And this is where it is challenging because all of the emitters need to reduce what they've been doing. So that means they need to change their business models, how they operate, how do they bring their activities while still surviving to within the limits that we need to see. And Eskom's obviously the big one, so by far our largest emitter, but it's also different to a normal company because obviously that's the electricity that we all use and all rely on, hopefully, when it's operating. Yeah, and it's the electricity sector is responsible for the bulk of that. So we need to rethink how we generate electricity. And there's a tremendous amount of work being done in all sorts of sectors, obviously by Eskom itself, by the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, academia, think tanks, modelers, scientists. So many minds are coming to this party, and then we often get to a situation where we're looking at political will. What is the will of the decision makers in terms of making the right choices? But the thing to bear in mind there are alternatives. Obviously, we're very reliant on coal. It's a historical legacy. It is a quote unquote resource that we have available, but it's also not necessary because we do have alternatives such as renewable energy.
And I must ask you also just the role that civil society is playing in all of this. I think it is an important part because, of course, when we're trying to think of government and the private sector and so on, sometimes that can also be very much, commercially motivated. But civil society has different, motivations here. And I'm keen to find out about the role that's being played in making sure that we do move towards a greener, economy, a greener energy here, but we also do it in the most sustainable way possible.
Yes, I think it's a critically important role, and it's worth sort of highlighting that there are different levels to civil society. So at the sort of more engaged levels in terms of empirical evidence and that kind of thing, I mean, civil society plays very much a watchdog role. So monitoring what is going on, monitoring the trends and developments, and making sure that those alternatives are put on the table as well. Because we're not sort of directly involved in the commercial interests of it, we can often bring voices to the table that aren't otherwise heard. But civil society also includes community-based organizations and people living in affected areas. The communities living around the power plants in the Mpumalanga Highveld are effectively being treated as sacrifice zones. So we have a health pandemic there in terms of respiratory diseases and others from the air quality and the air pollution out there. So how do we ensure that those voices are brought to the table? Because effectively we're asking those people to pay with their lives in some cases, so that everyone else can have electricity. And it's a big balancing act because we need electricity for development. There's no question about it. But is it okay to abandon 1.7 million people to be left to their own devices and battle these health issues without adequate public health response? And ultimately, because certain choices continue to be made, such as ongoing investment into coal, when that's not necessary and it's really sort of burdening the most vulnerable with the impacts.
Well, Brandon, it's all we have time for today, and I hope we can keep talking as this legislation is all rolled out. Thank you so much. That was Brandon Abdinor. He is acting program head for climate at the Center for Environmental Rights in PC.